woman simply took a nap on the plane. The view outside the window had turned into an eerie red. Countless pitch-black hands appeared in the sky tens of thousands of meters above the ground, incessantly tapping on the glass. Strangely, the passengers were all sound asleep, and even the flight attendants with their eyes wide open seemed utterly oblivious. In fact, the woman had noticed some anomalies as soon as she boarded the plane. The moment she sat down in her seat, the light above her head began to flicker non-stop. The man beside her reassured her that it was a normal occurrence, which put her slightly at ease. Immediately after, a commotion erupted from the rear cabin. An elderly lady, looking distraught, demanded to get off the plane right away. No matter how the flight attendants tried to comfort her, they couldn't calm her down. The woman, being a psychologist, rushed over to help. With her guidance, the old lady finally settled down considerably. After returning to her seat, the woman heard a metallic scraping sound coming from above. She asked the man next to her if he had heard it, but he looked puzzled and said he hadn't noticed anything. The sound kept echoing, and an inexplicable sense of unease welled up in her heart. The woman got up and ran into the restroom, hoping to compose herself with some cold water. However, a familiar voice suddenly came from outside the door, and the restroom door had changed its appearance. Pushing the door open, the woman found herself back in her childhood home. The house was empty and silent. At that moment, her mother's voice came from the bedroom. The woman hurriedly opened the door, only to find herself back in the airplane cabin. Everything that had just happened seemed like an illusion. Just as she was about to return to her seat, she felt someone staring at her from behind. When she turned to look, the shadowy figure had vanished without a trace. She was about to step forward to investigate when a hand suddenly landed on her shoulder. A flight attendant informed her to quickly return to her seat as the flight was about to take off. The woman was perplexed, but had no choice but to comply. Soon after, the passengers all drifted off to sleep. The flight attendant at the front of the cabin sat silently, her eyes seemingly devoid of emotion. At that very moment, the airplane windows suddenly turned red, and pairs of black hands desperately pounded on the windows from the outside. Yet, the flight attendant remained absolutely motionless. Abruptly, the plane began to shake violently. It turned out they had encountered turbulence, and the flight attendants instructed the passengers to fasten their seatbelts and remain seated. At this point, an elderly gentleman in the cabin suddenly had an asthma attack and collapsed to the floor unconscious. The woman immediately directed everyone to lay the man flat and started performing first aid. Surprisingly, the old man suddenly opened his eyes, grabbed the woman, and kept muttering something. The woman, startled and panicked, pushed the man away. The other passengers seemed not to have witnessed what had just transpired and were instead frightened by the woman's actions. Subsequently, the man began to convulse repeatedly. The man kept calling out the woman's name, trying to wake her from her nightmare. But at that very instant, the woman saw a pitch-black hand extending from the very back of the seats.